The devil is in the details. That is a statement so true, so powerful, that it accurately describes almost everything, from video editing to the ways an engine works to a relationship. It describes it all accurately. The devil is in the details. It's not the big picture you have to worry about, it's the details. That's where you're going to run into issues. That's where the important stuff is. And that is no more true than it is of the Russian Revolution, because we all understand the big picture of the Russian Revolution, right? The Russian people taking the Tsar out of power, establishing communism. That's the big picture. But you run into an issue when you start looking at the details and how many different ideas and people and events and places were really involved in bringing about the Russian Revolution. But more on that in a moment. Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCauley, and we are here on Our Dark History, where we discuss the darkest people, places, and events in human history. In this episode, we are going to be discussing the book and the year 1905, written by Leon Trotsky, one of the craziest people during the Russian revolutionary times. He played a very important role in establishing the USSR. He really played a part in bringing down the Tsarist regime, and this is one of his major life works, this book, 1905. It is so important because he goes into the history of Russia, how the Russian Revolution came about. If you're interested in Leon Trotsky, I am currently working on a biocast episode about his life, and it is going to be amazing. He is such a complex figure, and there is just so many details that we can go into with his life. And again, the devil is in the details. But for this video, this podcast episode, we are going to be looking at his book, 1905, because it is so important, not only for his life, not only for the Russian Revolution, but for world history. Because what happens to Russia impacts the entire world. It impacts Asia, it impacts Europe, even the Americas. It's a very important time period here. So without any further ado, let's get right on into it. In the beginning of the book, he talks about how the Russo-Japanese War, where Russia was defeated by a smaller Asian country, really laid the groundwork for the revolutionary atmosphere, we can call it, because that's really what it was. The communists, they had a really hard time selling communism to the Russian people. These were people that were steeped in tradition that had been hundreds of years old. They were the least metropolitan Europeans. They were much closer to resembling, their Asian peers. People that really didn't want to bother too much with all of that stuff. They just wanted their tradition. And boy, the communists, they had a much easier time selling communism after the defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, because no longer was the country's safety guaranteed by the government. Because when you have a government that's abusive and regressive and backward, it's one thing if they can at least protect you, right? They can at least do their job. They might be horrible, but they can do their job. But when they lose this war against Japan, Japan was seen as a second-class citizen, especially with some of the racial views at the time. They basically viewed the Japanese like yellow monkeys. And here was Russia losing a war against them. So it was just a big blow to morale. And people really lost their faith in the ability of the government to execute its functions. And Trotsky accurately calls 1905 the prologue to the 1917 revolution. Because 1917 is when they officially take power, but 1905, if you don't have 1905, 1917 never happens. And that's a fact. Because everything changed in 1905. Both for the people, for the laws, for the government, and especially for the communists. So he begins the book by talking about what changed in 1905 and a little bit of Russian history. So he talks about 1905 kind of destroying Russian uniqueness. Because Russia is this very strange, unique country. It's unlike anything in Europe. It's not like anything in Asia. It is this weird amalgamation of different cultures and people groups and ideas and religions, and it's just all so strange. And their government was definitely one of these things that was, unique to Russia. No one else had a czar. There were other people that had absolute monarchs. I mean, we had the Kaiser in Germany. We had, we still have a king in the UK, right? But when it comes to Russia, it was a very different kind of king. It was actually heavily influenced by Genghis Khan, the one from like the 12 and 1300s, the Mongolian invasion, the Golden Horde. That invasion carried implications all the way into the 1900s that impacted the Russian Revolution. Oddly enough, which it's just insane to think about, but it changed the way the government worked in Russia. And when you change the way the government worked, man, you change a lot, especially with a country as important as Russia. Now, Russia always had a horrible tax system. They did not encourage entrepreneurship. They kind of forced people into poverty in a lot of ways. Even when the liberal reforms came around, from time to time. There was a point in 1861, they got some liberal reforms. There were other points where the peasants were given some rights. But the problem there was that there were these horrible taxes. Why on earth would you want to try to start your own business if you're going to end up having to pay like half of all the money you make to the government? Right? Like, it's just impossible to compete. And then another big thing that really made the situation tricky was Russia's increasing dependence on Western European loans, right? You start letting those Western European bankers control your country, man, that's a bad sign. Never become financially beholden to a foreign power. That is rule number one in geopolitics, and maybe just politics in general. Don't become beholden to someone else's money. And the European way of life was very different than the Asian despotism, right? And a lot of people, especially Trotsky, right? He makes the argument that the Tsarist regime was closer to Asian despotism than European absolute monarchy, which you can have your own opinion about that. You can read more about it in 1905 itself if you'd like to check it out. But, that he basically makes that argument. And then he also talks about the semi-liberation reform after the Crimean War in 1861. So this is one of those liberal reform periods that I talked about where, the people are technically freed from being a serf, working on someone else's land where they're basically slaves. But in practice, it's like, well, I'm free now. Well, and that means free to die in the streets. And that's kind of what happened in a lot of places. And then, it didn't even matter anyway, because the next czar, he came in and he walked back all of the liberal reforms. So it was like, oh, well, I hope you enjoyed your freedom for like the couple years it lasted. Whoop-de-doo. Now, when Trotsky talks about Russia, he really breaks it down into three major parts. And these are really important to understand Russia, right? So number one is the industrial region, Petersburg and Moscow. The big cities, right? I mean, these are like it's like the Russian New York City, the Russian London. There's all the big industrialization going on here, all the big corporations, the big companies, big money. It's all going down here. Now, the second big region is the southeastern region near the Black Sea, the Volga River. This is where the productive and lucrative farms all happen to be. And side note, this was in what's modern-day Ukraine, a lot of this area, and there was already a growing sense of Ukrainian nationalism, and they wanted to be free from the Russian Empire. Like, they didn't want to be part of this whole government, but they were just kind of stuck there. It's really hard getting independence, and having a different people group rule over your people group when you're the ones that's making all the food, oh, that's tough. That is very tough. Who wants to be the... imagine being like your entire people group is the group that's responsible for making most of the food, and you get ruled by, some Russian living over in Moscow. No one wants that. Now, this third region, this is the rough region. And it's just about everywhere else. Trotsky has a word for it. He calls it Black Earth. There's no industry, there's no agriculture, the rent is high and the wages are low. And it's so impoverished that bed bugs and cockroaches are literally a sign of wealth. Right? So he talks about a doctor he knows, Dr. Shingarev. Sorry for the mispronunciation. And I'm sorry for any of the other mispronunciations throughout this episode. I'm not going to go on a tangent every time, but I do mispronounce just about everything I can. So I'm sorry in advance because I can't help it. But Dr. Shingarev, he talks about how a family's wealth in this Black Earth area is measured by the amount of bugs inside, right? Like, think about that. So if there is too much starvation, there's too much cold in these poorer houses, like if you're really, really poor, it's so cold and inhospitable that the bugs can't live inside of your bed. You don't have any bed bugs because the bed bugs think it's too harsh an environment to live. Just think about how poor that really is. I mean, imagine living like that. Imagine being a father and you go home and your children have to sleep in a bed that's too cold and inhospitable for bugs to live in it. And that's the life you live. And meanwhile, all of this misery and suffering and hardship is going on in your life, and the Russian Tsar is over there trying to fight foreign wars against Japan. And he's going to draft you to fight it. And then you come home, you don't get any compensation, you just go back to living like this, in Black Earth, where you're sleeping in a bed that's too cold for bed bugs. Really rough time period. Well, he also goes into detail about the driving forces of the Russian Revolution. And keep in mind, when he talks about the Russian Revolution in this book and throughout the rest of it, he means the revolution of 1905, not the 1917 one. Because in many ways, people saw the 1905 revolution as like the Russian Revolution. And it was on many accounts, but, you know, they don't actually overthrow the government just yet. They just get some reforms. But he talks about some of these driving forces, right? Like, so the cities were unproductive. He compares Moscow and Petersburg, which were very industrialized, growing cities, but he compares them to Paris, Berlin, London, Vienna. They can't hold a candle to these other European cities because Petersburg and Moscow, I mean, they're just kind of second-class cities, right? I mean, unfortunately, Moscow was like Detroit. And, you got places like Berlin, and they're like the New York City of the time. So it's just kind of the way things were going. And even Moscow had to depend on the Tsar's land just to be sustainable for the companies and the bourgeoisie class. So they were, they may have been a little bit more industrialized, did not necessarily mean they were wealthier. Now, he also talks about the land distribution in the country. So 75 million desiatins, and a desyatin is a Russian land measurement, about 2.7 acres, so about 3. So these 75 million desiatins are distributed amongst 60,000 landowners. 1,250 desiatins per landowner. So to put that into context, 3,300 acres per one elite. So if you're a member of the ruling class, on average, you have 3,300 acres to your name. That's a lot of land. A lot of land. And there's a lot of people that are not part of that class. Now, he also criticizes the 1905 revolution. He calls it the bourgeoisie revolution, and here's why. It's really this change in government where the bourgeoisie is liberated from the chains of absolutism and feudal ownership. So basically now the bourgeoisie, the capitalists, the rich people, they're basically free from the monarchy and from all this other backward medieval crap, and they can move on and do what they want with their big money. So instead of being ruled by the monarchy, they are now owned by the bourgeoisie. Quote, Democracy unifies the nation by giving it a political ideology. The people, the petty bourgeoisie, the peasants, and the workers appoint the bourgeoisie as their deputies, and the orders issued to these deputies by the communes are written in the language of a bourgeoisie becoming conscious of its messianic role. Its messianic role. That's really how democracies work, isn't it? I mean, even think about it today. You take Leon Trotsky, you put him into modern day America, and he's going to be pointing out to everyone, you peasants, you working class people, you don't control the government. The rich people do, the bourgeoisie do. And that was the case then, it's the case now. Maybe that's just the way democracy works. Who knows? We can have another talk about that another time, but that's definitely how Trotsky felt about this bourgeoisie revolution going on in 1905. Now, he has a big chunk of this book dedicated to making fun of his enemies, primarily government bureaucrats, but he doesn't hold any punches, right? So he calls out other communists, Plekhanov and some of the other communists he mentions. I don't have every single example in here, but he does. If he feels like he wants to attack someone, he does it, man. He doesn't care. He's a wild man. But yeah, he really attacks these government bureaucrats. So he has one part of the book where he's quoting General Dragomirov, and he once wrote about the Minister of Internal Affairs, quote, "What sort of internal policies can he possibly have? He's only a cavalry NCO and a blockhead at that." But then came many more. Stockbrokers, soldiers, detectives, all failed. Every single one of them failed miserably. Trotsky speaking now. Quote, "All of them, one after the other, arrived with the firm intention of putting an end to sedition, restoring the lost prestige of authority, maintaining the foundations of the state, and every one of them, each in his own way, opened the floodgates of revolution and was himself swept away by its current." He's a very dramatic writer. You always got to appreciate that about Trotsky. But he was right. All of these ministers of internal affairs, they all failed. All of them. And on January 9th, 1905, the protests outside of the Winter Palace begin. And then Trotsky, at this part of the book, he quotes from the petition for the protest. Quote, "Before us lie only two paths, to freedom and happiness, or to the grave. Sire, point either of those paths to us and we shall follow, even if it is to the path towards death. Let our lives be sacrificed for long-suffering Russia. We are not sorry to make this sacrifice. We shall make it willingly." You can really hear the call for freedom and liberation in the working class people here. And, let's make a distinction here, right? I think there's a lot of people who look back at the Russian revolutionary type and they kind of mischaracterize them all as being these thugs, right? The Joseph Stalins. But that's not how it was. The Tsarist regime really was this corrupt, horrible, bureaucratic nightmare to live under. This protest that's going on outside of the Winter Palace, it's led by a priest. Literally, a Russian Orthodox priest is leading the charge because the government is so horrible. And they're not necessarily against the Tsar. They just want their freedom. They just, listen, we understand, Mr. Tsar Nicholas II, you're in charge. We love you. We acknowledge your leadership. But please, give us some rights, man. We need some rights. And when they asked for their rights, they received bullets. And then Trotsky adds, quote, "And they made the sacrifice." A lot of people died in that massacre. It became known as Bloody Sunday. Now, Trotsky goes into detail about the entire incident, and he claims that the government allowed the situation to grow into what it became. The government even allowed the Telegraph to write about it. Quote, "Every Paris concierge knew 3 days in advance that there was going to be a revolution in Petersburg on Sunday, January 9th. And the Russian government did not move a finger to avoid the massacre." So on top of all of the ills that they have against the government at this point. They knew it was coming. They didn't do anything to stop it. And then they had this horrible reaction where, the Tsar's men literally fired bullets into a peaceful crowd of protesters. Talk about a PR disaster. Like, you could not have... it's almost like they intentionally went out of their way to do, like, everything that they should not have done. Like, it's almost as if the government was antagonizing the revolution in some ways. Just absolutely insane. Now, he also points out the government's lackluster reaction. Quote, "At a meeting of the Committee of Ministers on January 11th, Count Witt, not then in power, proposed that the events which had taken place on the 9th and the measures for the future prevention of such regrettable events be discussed. Witt's proposal was rejected as not falling within the committee's competence and not included in the agenda for the present meeting. The Committee of Ministers allowed the beginning of the Russian Revolution to go unnoticed because the Russian Revolution was not on its agenda." Damn. What a shot right there. I could only imagine being a Russian citizen at this time and reading something like that. It's absolutely true. The government, it allowed all this to go on because, well, it's not on the agenda. It's not on the agenda. When sometimes you hear or read, a statistic about, the US government, for example, and it does this, this stupid, horrible thing so inadequately, it's so inept, it's just a horrible nightmare, and you just sit there like, man, stupid government. Just imagine that feeling times like a million. The Russian government's like letting the revolution happen. And, well, it's not on the committee or it's not on the agenda, so oh well, we can't do anything about it. We'll deal with it next time. Maybe it'll be on the agenda next time. Absolutely insane. And this points out the government's horrible ineptitude. News of Bloody Sunday caused 122 additional revolts. People were mad. They were done with this. These were their fellow Russian comrades, their fellow citizens, and there was a priest. There's a religious component to all of this. It's just insane. It's like, it's one thing to be regressive and attack your own people, but, you get someone as religious as the Russian people were, and still are. And oh boy, you're stepping on the wrong toe. Now, in response to what was going on, the people started revolting everywhere. They successfully shut down a bunch of railways all across the country in early October, isolating Moscow economically and logistically. So you start shutting down commerce, business, supplies. We're talking firewood, food, water. These are all things Moscow needs. The people in Moscow are really going to be feeling that heat now. It's going to be rough. 750,000 railway workers went on strike. The communists were really getting some leverage here. They were really getting some power here. Think about it. 750,000 railway workers. Talk about stopping the economy. This is the way transportation was. Remember, this is before cars. I think cars were invented by this time, but it's not like a lot of people had them, or especially not in Russia. So the railway was like the only thing you had to get around. Move goods, move people. And all of the work, all these workers went on strike. Whew. And then shortly after, the communists established the Soviet of Workers. And the Soviet is actually just another word for council. It's one of those words, I think in the West we get this really confused. It has like a gazillion different meanings. It just means a council of people or workers. And after they had organized this Soviet, quote, "Recognizing the inadequacy of passive struggle and of the mere cessation of work, we resolve to transform the army of the striking working class into a revolutionary army. That is to say, to organize detachments of armed workers forthwith." They were ready to turn these working class people that were done working, into a revolutionary militia. Workers stopped working and began gathering in colleges. So they were going to these places, they were discussing what has to be done, what should be done, how do we make things okay. On October 14th, 1905, the Russian Prime Minister Trepov, a conservative monarchist, issued his famous order, quote, "No blank volleys and spare no bullets." The next day, he granted 3 municipal buildings to replace colleges for meetings. And you see, if you're someone that's of a conservative nature, someone that wanted to preserve the monarchy, and you see stuff like that go on, I mean, it's so hard to respect people that they try to uphold the establishment and then they do stuff like this. I mean, one day it's like, we're not going to spare a single bullet against these protesters, and then the next day you're issuing them buildings. I mean, what a sign of weakness. I mean, how do you respect someone when they just, in one day they cave? And Trotsky definitely doubled down on this and really used it to his own advantage. Quote, "What a change in 24 hours. Yesterday, we were ripe only for bullets. Today, we are ripe enough for popular meetings. The murderous villain is right. In these great days of struggle, the people of Russia are maturing by the hour." He really did not like Trepov. The murderous villain. Damn. And the Tsar signed the Constitutional Manifesto on October 17th, basically granting people some rights. This was supposed to be the liberal reform that was going to bring about the change, but we'll see. Trotsky gave a little bit of a speech, quote, "Citizens, our strength is in ourselves. With sword in hand, we must stand guard over our freedom. As for the Tsar's manifesto, look, it's only a scrap of paper. Here it is before you. Here it is crumpled in my fist. Today, they have issued it. Tomorrow they will take it away and tear it into pieces, just as I am now tearing up this paper freedom before your eyes." They were not buying it. It wasn't enough. They got the Tsar to issue a constitutional manifesto, and it wasn't enough for them. That's when you knew things were going to get heated. And of course, throughout this entire book, he excuses violence against imperial politicians. Now, there was a Russian minister of the interior, Plaev. He was assassinated by socialist revolutionaries, literally bombed. And Trotsky uses the word, in quotation marks, retired. Oh yeah, the minister of interior, Plaev, he retired. Wasn't assassinated. He retired. And this is something about downplaying violence that I really dislike. Because we have to be honest about what's going on here. He'd have used a different tone if it were one of his comrades killed by a bomb. I mean, what a horrible way to go. Living in fear and, this guy had multiple assassination attempts and it took like 3 or 4 to finally get him. And as much as you can believe in your cause, you need to take responsibility for when your people do something wrong. You need to denounce violence. But instead of denouncing it, Trotsky, he encourages it, when he can. And when he can't, he downplays it, right? Uses words like retired. And it's something you have to watch out for, right? Because this is one of those real world applicable skills that you can use, look in political people. Anyone that's involved in politics or popular mass movements, how do they speak about their enemies? The wrong things that their own group does. Do they try to downplay their own side's violence? Or are they honest about it? It's an important question to ask. Now, it talks about the first days of freedom for a few pages. And he talks about people still being imprisoned, still being censored, still being persecuted by the Tsarist regime. Nothing has really changed. Now, Trotsky quoted another Marxist newspaper, quote, "We have been given a constitution, but the autocracy remains. Everything has been given, and nothing has been given." freedoms have been granted in name only. So, in practice, nothing really changed. And I can imagine the frustration, right? Because it must have, immediately when it happened, it's like, oh boy, we finally got our freedom that we've been fighting for. And well, all of the imprisonment continues, the censoring of the newspapers and the books and the literature, the persecution still goes on. Nothing really changed. The general strike continues. Now, in response to the strike continuing, right? Because in the Tsarist regime, in their own minds, they were like, we just gave in. We let them have the rights that they've wanted for all this time. So why aren't you guys stopping the strike? Well, the Tsarist regime decides that they're going to strike back. And Trotsky goes into detail about how exactly they did it. Quote, "The Soviet brought the strike to an end during those terrible black days when the cries of slaughtered infants, the frenzied curses of mothers, the dying gasps of old people, and savage howls of despair rose to the heavens from every corner of the country. 100 of Russia's towns and townlets were transformed into hells. A veil of smoke was drawn across the sun. Fires devoured entire streets with their houses and inhabitants. This was the old order's revenge for its humiliation. You make a fool of me, I'm gonna kill you." It's basically what the Russian government did. And then pogroms began occurring across the country with the government's approval. And this was especially bad against the Jewish community, right? So the Russians and the Jews, they have a really tricky history. We can get into a whole other discussion about the relations there. But the pogroms, they basically happened because the reactionary right in Russia, they were basically saying, listen, this revolutionary business, this isn't going to happen without any Jews. You kick out the Jews, get rid of the communists. So let's not improve our government. Let's just kick out the Jews, because, that makes sense. So it's really one of those tricky things that's going on. But, I mean, the Jews were very much active in the communist community, but for different reasons. It's not because they're trying to destroy Russian society. We can have another discussion about that another time. But they continued the struggle for the 8-hour workday. That's really one of the big things that the peasantry wanted. They were tired of working all day long. I mean, 12 and sometimes more hours a day. I mean, a 12-hour shift is rough. Even when you're doing a mediocre job, sitting at a desk, right? Imagine 16 hours sometimes of hard labor. That's how it was for these people. There was a female revolutionary who gave a speech, quote, "You've let your wives get accustomed to sleeping in soft beds and eating sweet food." She hurled at the Putilov delegates. "That's why you are afraid of losing your jobs. But we aren't afraid. We're prepared to die. But we'll get the 8-hour day. We'll fight to the end. Victory or death. Long live the 8-hour day." These people were tired of being abused. They were ready to die. A lot of them really were. And then the general peasantry, they just broke out in complete revolutions all over the place. And remember, because Russia is such a rural country at the time, it's not like there's any one place that the revolution is happening at. It's really just, this one principality or this one district or county or whatever you want to call it. They're just breaking out into chaos and, killing government officials. And, it was too rural of a country to really be able to say that there's a revolution going on here or there. Now, the president of the Soviet had been arrested at this point, and then they had another election to replace him. And Trotsky, while he was writing about the election for this next president of the Soviet, he used the words "openly as always." And I just find this to be suspicious phrasing. Now, we as 21st century listeners or viewers, we know that the USSR was kind of like a gang of communist thugs. But at the time, people didn't really know that. And of course, it wasn't all of the communists. I think there were a lot of good, meaning people that really wanted, the ideals that they were fighting for. But they weren't the ones that got the power at the end. It was people that were cruel and sadistic, like Joseph Stalin. But when I see words like openly as always, I mean, it's almost out of place, right? I mean, why do you have to tell the people, oh yeah, our elections are open as always? It's almost like the honest guy that always tells everyone how honest he is. Oh, I never lie. I'm always honest about everything. Oh, and it's almost suspicious because he ends up being the con man, right? It's like when you have to constantly say something, it's because it's not true. So I don't know if that was really the case. Who knows if the communist thug culture really set in at this time. We don't really know. I mean, Trotsky says they were, held as openly as always. Well, maybe they were always very not open. As free as always, says the slave. Now, the foreign money interests were starting to purchase property while the Russian nobles were fleeing abroad. That creates a horrible dynamic on the country. It's really rough because now there's more and more land, more and more businesses that are controlled by foreigners. And, as you know, especially during this time with nationalism and everything, people did not trust foreigners. Especially, you got some rich German banker coming in buying a bunch of land. That doesn't do any good for the Russian Revolution, right? Now, the roads and schools and the railways, they're all falling into absolute disrepair, right? I mean, the government, in a lot of ways, it's just stopped functioning in any meaningful capacity. And then Trotsky describes the horrible economic policies of this unchecked government. Quote, taking advantage of the absence of any control of state finances, the government has long been issuing loans which far exceeds the country's means of payment. With these new loans, it is covering the interest on old ones. So, yeah, the Russian government's debt, it's getting up there. It is getting up there. And they're not just going into debt. They're going into debt to foreign powers. Never a good thing to be. Now, he speculated that the Russian government wanted people to die fighting to safeguard its own malicious activities. And if you look at the way governments operate, you owe a lot of people a lot of money, and sometimes it's just easier to kill them off, to start a war, and hey, maybe they die. Maybe this is my tinfoil hat side talking here, but you look at any big war, the civilization that was involved in that war, they almost always were in a lot of debt just before. And then, well, how do you get out of having to pay the people? Well, start a war, kill them off. I mean, a lot of World War II soldiers were owed a lot of benefits after, World War II. And well, what do you know? You got to go back and fight another war. And a lot more people died in Vietnam than World War II. Or Korea Anyway, getting back to 1905. Martial law was declared in many provinces, including Kiev. And Kiev is the modern-day capital of Ukraine, and it was a very important city for the Russian Empire. It was very metropolitan. It's actually where Trotsky spent a good portion of his childhood. And he describes the situation and also calls out Plekhanov, quote, with a clear image of Russia at that time, one realizes how inevitable was the December conflict. The showdown should have been avoided, say certain wise men in their hindsight. And then he has parentheses, Plekhanov. And again, this guy's a fellow communist, right? He worked with Plekhanov in London, working for the Marxist newspaper there. And he's calling him out. What a thug. Honestly, there are a lot of things I don't like about Trotsky, but things like that, I can almost admire that. He's a wild card. And then there were even more strikes in December. Oh boy. And then he started advising revolutionaries to fire from unarmed crowds and civilian buildings. And this is where we really have to take a step back and say, okay, a line has been crossed here. You don't fire from unarmed crowds in civilian buildings. That's a terrorist tactic. That's what they start doing. But because they recognize, well, they can get shots off at the Russian government officials, the military police. And then if they fire back, well, they're probably going to hit a civilian. And then they can run in their Marxist newspapers, oh, the Russian police shot another Russian civilian. So it was a lose-lose situation for the Russian government. It was really tough. And, a lot of Marxist revolutionary types, they really did this stuff. They went into crowds and with their rifles and they shot at cops. And then the cops couldn't really do anything. And it's just really one of those things that you have to take a step back and say, all right, you crossed the line here. This should not have happened. And this was a tactic primarily of the Bolsheviks, although it wasn't just the Bolsheviks. But we can have more on that discussion another time. And yeah, these were just immoral guerrilla warfare tactics used to, shoot at the ruling class, the police officers, and it was just a horrible thing to do. Now, he gets to this one point where he talks about the necessity to do this stuff, and he actually quotes Marx, but this Karl Marx quote was actually written by Engels. Quote, "In revolution as in war, it is absolutely necessary at the decisive moment to stake everything, whatever the chances of the struggle. History does not know a single successful revolution that does not testify to the correctness of this proposition. Defeat after persistent struggle is a fact of no less revolutionary significance than an easily snatched victory. In any struggle, it is absolutely inevitable that he who throws down the glove runs the risk of being defeated. But is that a reason to declare oneself defeated from the start and to submit without drawing the sword? Anyone who commands a decisive position in a revolution and surrenders it instead of forcing the enemy to venture an attack deserves to be regarded as a traitor." If you don't use these guerrilla tactics to advance the cause of the revolution, you're not a comrade, you're a traitor. The causes of this Russian revolution here. And he actually talks a lot about the criticisms and kind of debunks some of those. And he quotes a contemporary intellectual, quote, "The inexorable logic of economic development created a situation where all strata of the population, with the exception of the feudal nobility, were finally compelled to adopt a position hostile to the government." And really, this quote is very true. If you weren't a have, you were a have-not. And it wasn't just a little bit of a difference. It was a big difference. And there were a lot more have-nots than there were haves. But then he also attacks this very same guy. I'm going to attempt a pronunciation. Cherevinen? He was a contemporary intellectual at the time. But they disagreed on the intentions of the Russian protesters at the Winter Palace in 1905. Because Trotsky thinks that they demanded change, and Cherevinen believed that they pleaded for change. And I think this really ties into Trotsky's idealism, because he wanted to see the Russian people really call more attention and respect for themselves. Because, this is like his big narrative, right? He's kind of like, he probably saw himself as the messiah of the Russian Revolution. And it only makes logical sense that he would be like, oh yeah, they didn't plead. They weren't begging for change. They were demanding it. So I think that's Trotsky's own idealism getting in the way of things. But then he calls Cherevinen impractical, and he quotes Martin Luther. Quote, "Theology is concerned with life and should not consist of mere meditation and reflection on the affairs of God according to the laws of reason. Every art, whether it be intended for domestic usage or for the world, is rendered null and worthless if it becomes mere speculation and cannot be applied in practice." So he basically says that the Russian revolutionary working class, they need to be practical. They need to take Karl Marx's words, and they need to make those words action. And it's really telling that Trotsky quotes Martin Luther. Martin Luther, he was the guy that did the Protestant Reformation, right? The big split between the Catholics and the Protestants. Why would he quote a theologian? It's weird, really weird. And I almost have to wonder, is it a Freudian slip? Is this Trotsky's subtle way of saying that communism is his religion? Because you really have to wonder. Trotsky was born and raised in a Jewish family, but they were like secular Jews, right? Did he replace that need, that belonging, the whatever identity that you get out of your religion, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or what? Did he replace that with communism? Because the way that he wrote this little, these couple of pages here and then uses Martin Luther's quote, was Karl Marx's writing the Bible to Trotsky? Maybe. Really could make an argument. He also includes a Polish article published during the time that criticizes Bolshevism. And again, Trotsky was not a Bolshevist or a Bolshevik or a Menshevik. He really, for a long time, he wanted unity. He wanted all of the communists to come together and say, listen, we all agree that Karl Marx was right, that we need to overthrow the Tsar, we need to stop capitalism, that's what we need to do. We can all agree on this. But of course, there's this internal division, and that didn't really happen. Now, he discusses Russia's condition, and he mentions those who view the 1905 revolution as a national defense issue. Because, during this time, this is one of those points where the way you perceive the revolution as it's going on, especially as in a year as important as 1905, the way you view it is really that's important. That changes the way you react to the revolution, how you should go about it, what you should do in response to it. And then he writes how this opinion was, quote, apparently shared by everyone from Romanov to Plekhanov. So not only did he say Romanov and Plekhanov in the same sentence, but he's comparing the two. He said, not only am I mentioning them both here, they have the same opinion about something. So, it's one of those things where it's ooh. I really wonder what Plekhanov thought about Trotsky writing this. He also goes into some statistics about the Russian Social Democratic Party. He mentions how there were 140 members of the party who spent 138 years in jail, collectively, right? And 148 years in exile. So if you take into account the 942 years of involvement with the party, periods in prison and exile made up 1/3 of the total time in the party. And then he mentions that, these numbers are even optimistic. Now, this is one of those things where if that's true, that's really, it's really sad. It's a really sad reflection on how repressive the Tsarist regime was. Think about it. 1/3 of all the time that your, party members have been in the party, 1/3 of all that time has been spent in prison or exile. Absolutely insane. I do say take it with a grain of salt, though, because, this is, the 1900s. How much can we reliably trust how he came to these numbers and conclusions? Don't really know. It's hard to say for sure, but he does, he has it in the book. And there are only a handful, Trotsky, he doesn't lie a whole lot. So, these numbers could be real. Now, he describes the arrests in the Soviet. He included a transcript of his own speech at the court denying guerrilla tactics and violence because, of course, you got to be modest and include a transcript of your own speech before the court. That's who Trotsky was. And in the speech, he differentiates between the socialists and the anarchists. And it really comes down to the issue of the necessity of the state. Now, there were a lot of people who were anarchists at this time, and it kind of makes sense, right? Because we kind of have the political pendulum, swinging back and forth, right? And when you live under an extreme bureaucracy government, you kind of swing to the opposite side and you say, yeah, no government. We're at absolute government over here. This sucks. Let's go to no government, see what that looks like. So a lot of people went that way, as opposed to socialism. But, again, kind of tough. I don't think there's ever really been an example of a civilization without a government. So Trotsky understood this. And he ends the book with his escape on the train. Quote, "While I was traveling on the narrow-gauge Ural Railway, I was not yet safely out of the danger. On a local branch, every foreigner is noticed at once, and, had the appropriate instructions been received by telegraph from Tobolsk, I might well have been arrested at any station. But when I changed and was traveling in a comfortable carriage of the Perm Railway, I knew that I had won. The train passed the same stations at which we had been met, so recently, by so many gendarmes, police, and troops. But now I was going in the opposite direction, and my feelings, too, were entirely different. At first, the spacious, almost empty carriage seemed close and stuffy to me. I went and stood on the open, connecting platform between two coaches. It was dark. A strong wind was blowing, and a loud cry burst spontaneously from my breast, a cry of happiness and freedom. Meanwhile, the train of the Perm Kotlas Railway was carrying me forward, always forward." And that was 1905 by Leon Trotsky. Now keep in mind, these were snippets and things that I thought were important for history, the Russian Revolution, for Leon Trotsky's life specifically. This is my own subjective take on it, so just keep that in mind. I'm not a historian, I just like history. If you guys want to check it out yourselves, be sure, I will leave a link in the description. You can read the thing for free. You got nothing to lose but time. So go on ahead, check that out, give it a read. It's a really, really fascinating piece of work. But I really hope you guys enjoyed this little presentation here on 1905. This was so fulfilling. I really enjoyed doing this. And I hope it gave you guys a better understanding of who Leon Trotsky was, how the Russian Revolution was unfolding, and really what was really going on in Russia in 1905. Be sure to check out any of my social media sites. If you guys like Instagram or Medium or Twitter or anything like that, be sure to check those out. I've also got some documentaries on Amazon I think you guys would love. And always remember, you can check out Biocast at biocast.xyz or check out the Dark History Podcast. We got a whole bunch of episodes, and yeah. So thank you so much for listening all the way through. I really appreciate you guys, and I will see you in the next one. Peace out.